So, we're going to talk here some about change and adaptation. We've been looking at the industry life cycle. I gave you a little reading of work I did quite a while ago on the mix of strategies and industry variety and the impact that might have on change. Um, the issue when you talk about change and adaptation is, there's a whole course you could offer on how firms can adapt and change and the challenges to that. So really all we can hope to do here is kind of touch on some highlights of it. So let's see if we can't at least do a little of that, and then we'll pick it back up in the next lesson when we talk about strategies in technology-oriented industries, where certainly change and adaptation is an ongoing issue. Um, Also, kind of keep in mind here that, we spent the first part of the course talking about putting together a package. Now, strategy that addresses the environment, strategy that is supported by the capabilities and builds on unique capabilities. And all of that kind of suggests that we're putting something together we're going to stay with for a while. But now we kind of recognize that the world changes, industries change, and firms have to change with that. So let's kind of see what the barriers are to changing, what firms might do to respond to it, how that whole process kind of works. So it starts by kind of asking this bigger question: how does industry change occur? All right. And really, we can break that down and say, does change come from existing firms adapting and altering their approaches, or does it come from new firms with new approaches replacing the existing firms? And the answer, as it turns out, is probably that it's a little bit of both. And we can think of some situations where it's likely to be more one than the other. So, for example, uh, if you're talking about what in the book they call competence enhancing versus competence destroying technological changes, uh, if we're enhancing the existing competencies, existing firms have a decent opportunity to not only respond when someone else offers it, but also to get better and extend the things they're doing along the same path. Uh, However, when it's something entirely different, that's more likely to come from somebody else, somebody new coming in, and existing firms are going to have a harder time dealing with that. Um, if we think about architectural versus component innovation, if it's a whole new way of putting uh, the product together, a whole new business model, if you will, again, existing firms are less likely to be the ones who do that, and more likely to have trouble adapting when other firms come in and offer new ways of approaching the whole market. Sustaining versus disruptive technologies, again, kind of a variation on this theme. The more it is sustaining, the more it is augmenting and extending existing things. Um, the easier it is going to be for existing firms to respond to this, and they may even be the ones who introduce it, but very different performance attributes, more likely to be introduced by a new firm and harder for existing firms to respond to. With that, let's kind of think about for a minute, what is it that causes inertia? That is, why is it that organizations have a hard time changing? Well, a variety of factors play into this. Um, One is existing organizational routines. We want to get better at the things we do. We want to be more efficient, more effective, and that's great. But the more efficient and effective we get at certain things, the harder it is to change those, the harder it is to uh, even recognize new things. Um, the existing social and political structures that get in place in an organization make it hard for firms to adapt. We do things certain ways, and it's easier to keep doing them that way, and the powers that be want to protect their turf and all of that. So conformity, this is kind of outside the firm, but there's a whole theory of institutional isomorphism. That is, it says we begin to expect firms to look a certain way and behave a certain way if they're competing in a given industry. And new things disrupt that. So existing firms tend to kind of all begin to look a little bit alike. Limited search. Once we are within a set of routines, a set of structures, we're going to look for solutions close by. This comes from the bounded rationality notion of March and Simon and Sayert and others. Say, look, it's easier to look close to what we already know. It's been extended in some work on absorptive capacity. Says the more we know about certain things, the smarter we get about those things, but the harder it is to find new things. And then certainly this complementarities between strategy, structures, and systems. We talked about in previous lessons about putting a whole package together where all the pieces complement one another. And that's great. That makes for efficient and effective offerings. But it means that any change to any one of those causes issues for the others, which makes it hard to make change happen. So, in some ways, the things that help an organization compete and be effective also make it harder for that organization to adapt and change over time. There are various things that you can do to try to combat organizational inertia. You see kind of a list here. That notion of creating the perception of crisis. If things are going well, we don't tend to change. So if we can kind of create a sense of crisis, we may be more likely to do it. Various organizational initiatives, reorganizing, although hard to do, new leadership sometimes is necessary. Scenario analysis, playing kind of a what-if game and thinking down the road. If the world changes this way, how do we respond? All of these have been tried, have some level of success, but again, organizational inertia is a real thing. It's a real challenge, and none of these on their own are likely to be the answer. There are some other things that we can think about as we go through here. One is this issue of ambidexterity. Ambidexterity, like being ambidextrous, right? Using both your left hand and your right hand. In the case of a firm, ambidexterity says we need to maintain a dual focus. That is, we need to both exploit our existing capabilities and routines in our current markets, while at the same time explore for new capabilities and routines in current or different markets. This sounds a little bit familiar. It should. Sounds a little bit like an analyzer from Miles and Snow's typology. There's a lot of work done on ambidexterity. If you're really interested in it, Google organizational ambidexterity and you'll come up with lots of things. Bottom line, I think the idea makes great sense, but it is very challenging to accomplish. Firms tend to be better at either exploitation, kind of a defender approach, or exploration, a prospector approach, and finding a way to be good at both is a real challenge. Dynamic capabilities is another stream of research and advice that suggests that firms want to think about not just what they're good at now, but build in this larger ability to reconfigure and adapt over time, and that Actually, the ability to be dynamic in your capabilities is a higher order capability. Um, Again, the idea makes sense, but like ambidexterity, the challenge is in actually being able to do this. A few firms have gotten good at it. Many others try and kind of lose focus. A lot of this comes down to knowledge management. And there is, again, a whole stream of research on knowledge management, also relatedly learning, um, and this knowledge-based view. Again, some answers, but also some challenges. Um, One place you got to start with knowledge management is making this distinction between explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. Explicit knowledge, shown here is the knowing about, is stuff that you can write down, easily explain, codify, if you will, in some way. Explicit knowledge is great, it's valuable, a good thing to have, but while it's easier to exploit and use, it's a lot harder to protect, right? Because if it's explicit, if you can codify it, if you can write it down, other people can also get it and use it, and therefore it's kind of a weak area to build a sustainable advantage on. Tacit knowledge, on the other hand, knowing how, harder to articulate, harder to codify. Uh, you kind of learn by doing, observation, and practice. So that makes it a much better source for building a sustainable competitive advantage. But the challenge is, how do you replicate it within the firm? How do you extend it from one plant to another, from one division to another? That part is not easy. All right, so tacit knowledge more valuable, but also much, much harder to manage. We can look at a variety of aspects of knowledge, and again, you'll see kind of different lists depending which article you look at, but the basic idea of identifying knowledge, measuring it, retention, and then knowledge transfer and sharing. And a similar slide to this is in your book, and they talk about kind of nice examples. Note though that the vast majority of this stuff deals with explicit knowledge much more than it does tacit knowledge. All right, that to identify, to measure, to retain, and transfer is much easier with explicit knowledge. And again, there's value in doing that. Sharing best practices across the organization is a good thing. But it's really that tacit knowledge that is the more valuable. And that is easier said than done when it comes to transferring it and finding a way to make real use out of it. So, come back to this question, how does industry change occur? Well, existing firms adapting and altering? Yes, in some cases, there are firms that manage to build dynamic capabilities, to be ambidextrous, to transfer not only explicit but tacit knowledge. However, as we saw, when you're talking about more disruptive things, new business models, etc., going to be a lot harder for existing firms to deal with, to be the ones that generate and to respond to. So I would suggest that there is, again, some evidence of both that occur, and that in many instances we're going to see that existing firms are going to have a very, very hard time changing. So kind of take that and then move ahead here, and we'll come up with a little discussion, and also look at a case looking at a firm that is wrestling with a lot of changes right now and how to respond to those.